Thank you for that kind introduction. I hope I do know something about technology, seeing as I spend my days writing and editing about it. So I'm very fortunate in terms of my role. I get to spend my days talking to the entrepreneurs, the investors, the designers, the people who are really thinking about what's coming next, what's going to be meaningful coming down the pike, and the real transformational technologies that are really going to change business and change the way that we interact in the coming years. When I was thinking about this talk, I kind of did some research into how digital technology can transform mining. And one stat I found was a report by the World Economic Forum last year suggested that digital technology can help the global mining industry generate a benefit of around $190 billion over the next decade, just by improving decision making and increasing efficiency and productivity. So there's clearly a huge opportunity there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the sort of transformational technologies that we're seeing at Wired, and then maybe kind of see how maybe they can be applied to your particular industry. But before we get to that, I'd like to just offer just a little bit of context. So here's an image of three people you will recognize: Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, Buzz Aldrin, first three human beings to reach the moon back in July 1969. And I think kind of from the perspective of, where are we, November 2017, it's really easy to forget how incredibly tough it was to do what NASA did back then. The tiny event windows, the fact that when Eagle landed on the moon, it only had 25 seconds worth of fuel left, the fact that William Safire, who was then President Nixon's speechwriter, had already written a letter to the world saying that the three men had been lost. The very act of building the engineering and technology that allowed us to take three people to the moon and back 380,000 kilometers. Nothing like it had ever been done before. This is what got them there. So this is the Apollo guidance computer, the display and the interface. It weighs around 70 pounds. It's got a processor speed of 1 megahertz, a memory of roughly 4 kilobytes, and it cost hundreds of millions of US dollars to build. At that time, it was around 10% of US GDP was being invested in the Apollo program. And I just want to contrast that with something that's literally in my pocket right now. It's turned off as well. Weight 3.95 ounces. It's got a processor speed 1.4 gigahertz, a memory of 64 gigabytes. Cost me around 400 US dollars to buy. So math fans in the audience will have figured out that that thing in my pocket has around 1,400 times more processing power than NASA had back in July 1969. So by extrapolation, anyone in this room who has a relatively late model smartphone will have more processing power in their pockets than NASA had back then. So our mobile devices are just this most obvious example of how we're now all constantly connected to the network. Does anyone in the room think of themselves as a cyborg, right? An augmented human being? Every person is an augmented human being at some point now, because we have access to this incredibly powerful computing stack, and we have access to all the information that has ever been recorded. And we're in the mobile internet era now, but looking forward, the only constant is that there's going to be this relentless change that's going to be driven by data-centric technologies like artificial intelligence that will allow us to understand the world, to solve problems, drive efficiencies in ways that we've been unable to thus far. And just as we've become augmented human beings with our phones, so artificial intelligence and other technologies will mean that our organizations and our business practices will become augmented through the addition of new services based on processing and passing data in innovative ways. So we're entering the era of cognification. That's a Kevin Kelly line. We're entering the era in which there's no verb to say that things are getting smarter, but we're entering this era in which, if you compare it to the 20th century, when we electrified everything, in the 21st century, we're going to cognify everything we can. We will add intelligence to the machines and the processes that we're using. So Chris Anderson, the former editor of Wired in the United States, has a saying that the first 10 years of the internet were about finding new social and innovation models online. The next 10 would be about applying this to the real world. And we're right at the end of that 10-year cycle right now. What that means is the relationship between bits, the digital world, and atoms, the world that mining exists in, is getting much more complicated. But one thing that's for sure is it's moving very, very quickly, and things will probably never move this slowly ever again. And a great quote from Mark Andreessen, the entrepreneur and investor. software's eating the world. He's absolutely right. No industry, no business is immune. We now have internet-connected smart monitors for monitoring automation in healthcare and telecommunications, black box trading in the finance industry, robotics in manufacturing, artificial intelligence, natural language processing, machine learning, machine-to-machine systems that communicate over the internet without the mediation of human beings. So fundamentally now we need to think of ourselves as living inside this network where everything, our homes, our jobs, our cars, increasingly our bodies, are connected to the internet in real time on a highly, highly individualized basis. And what that means is that every business is transforming. And this isn't something that's happening in some realm in the future. It's happening now, it's happening today, and there is huge opportunity for everyone in this room to sort of take up that challenge. And we can see this in some of the most significant technological advances that are currently near term and the implications they have for all our businesses. So robotics, we already have, of course, autonomous robots that can do repetitive tasks, but increasingly we're going to have robots that we can deploy in new ways. The only trouble with AI is that in the future, their ancestors are going to, their descendants are going to go on YouTube and look up how we treated them back in the day, which might not end up too well for us. So from industrial uses, we're going to start seeing them moving more into the service industry, so healthcare, those kinds of places, and into our homes. There's already hospitals in Japan that, because Japan has a massive demographic challenge with many older people, not so many young people, they're being used in hospitals to help people get in and out of bed. They're also being used in the service industry. But I think this is maybe more interesting to people working in the mining industry. This is the most recent example of the research that Boston Dynamics is doing in its laboratory. It's just recently been purchased by SoftBank. No one had ever seen anything quite like this before. And one has to think of Boston Dynamics really as a kind of the Apple, if you like, of robotics. They combine hardware, software, and artificial intelligence. And what's fascinating about this is that robots usually are programmed to be very deliberate, to be slow, to be careful. But you look at the way that this robot's moving, it has almost like a sense of its own capabilities. And I think what maybe is important for the mining industry is that we're entering this new era of dexterity in robotics. So if you look at the balance of this machine, it's absolutely extraordinary. At the moment, we need to program robots to do just one particular task. And increasingly, we'll have robots that will learn from experience. They'll be able to sort through parts in warehouses or fit something of a different caliber that they're not used to seeing. And there are all kinds of startups right now in the Valley, like Embodied Intelligence and Microsci, that are trying to solve this very kind of complex problem of how we design software that will now enable robots to mimic very complex human behavior. Another challenge, and I think this is probably very kind of key for mining, is that we have to design these things so they don't harm human beings, right? We'll have to ensure that it makes its intentions clear when it's moving. And one of the challenges, I think, is how we're going to design our environments for robots to move around. And another, obviously, key challenge is how we develop that sensor technology, that LiDAR or radar, so that machines can interact with what's around them. I think maybe kind of the parallel to sort of draw in terms of the way we're going to get to with robotics is that think about like maybe elevators in the 19th century or ATM machines. They're kind of robots of a kind we don't even notice any longer. They're just part of the environment that we operate in. This is something that I think is similar. It's a robot called Starship. It's from a startup here in London, one of the founders of Skype. And essentially it's a delivery bot. And I think what's interesting about it is it asks all kinds of questions about how we get machines to move around an environment and how we get them to navigate human interaction. And I think that's going to be crucial in the next few years. We need to start building our environments with machines in mind. We have to make our landscapes and our cities machine readable to robotics. So drones used to always only be available to the military. Now they can be purchased cheaply, used in all kinds of practices, agriculture, city planning. I know they're being used in mining at the moment. And I think that we really need to start sort of thinking about changing the metaphor when we think about drones. And so we need to stop thinking of them as these flying objects, and we need to start thinking about them a little bit more as these almost servers, like in the sky, sucking up this data, this information that then can be passed and used. There's all kinds of startups in the valley at the moment, like Planet Labs and Spire Global, that are putting very cheap satellites into space as well. And this growing array of satellites, this growing array of drones, is going to mean that we have access to images of any place on the planet at any moment in time. A volume of data completely impossible for human beings to process. So analysis will obviously have to be done by machines, deep learning, artificial intelligence, and that will scale up our ability to spot geo-economic trends across the world. So that could be deforestation, it could be the geology of a certain region, the amount of trucks on a particular stretch of road, the number of pedestrians entering a shopping mall. And in terms of mining, I think drones can have a whole series of impacts. Firstly, safety. So they can ensure that the areas are clear before a blast takes place, or track fumes after a blast has happened. They can also improve safety on site by monitoring traffic, road conditions, and hazards. Maintenance. Maintenance teams are now using them to inspect overhead cranes, towers, roofs of buildings, so they don't have to work at height. Productivity, absolutely crucial. Drones have got military-grade cameras now, so we can provide real-time aerial footage and 3D mapping of sites. It's far cheaper, obviously, than using planes. And savings can be considerable. BHP Billiton estimates savings at one site in Queensland to be around $4 million US a year. So with drones, we can gather more information about our sites than ever before. We can move quickly, we can measure accurately, we can look at stockpiles, we can review compliance to design against kind of plans that we've drawn up, and understand how we can improve safety or boost productivity. Clearly, they can be used for mapping and discovery. They can also be used for transporting samples so that surveyors can spend less time on site and gathering data in the field and more time doing the important stuff, which is interpreting it. I think also crucially, what we can use them for is predictive trends. So satellite companies now offer clients in financial services predictive data about the quarterly performance of big box retailers like Walmart or others, simply by looking at images of parking lots, the type of car, how many passengers, when they arrive, what the weather was like, that kind of thing. So there is a huge opportunity here for productivity. In terms of the bigger picture, this is part of an industry that's now trying to solve some of the problems that we face in a kind of a geospatial way. So that could be images from drones or cell phone counts or car counts from connected vehicles, which we're increasingly going to have. And this can be analyzed at scale and provide crucial data to all kinds of industries, including mining. This is what's happening in Dubai at the moment. This is a trial scheme, it's happening. This isn't some kind of sci-fi thing. They're trying to figure out ways of working with the Chinese drone manufacturer EHang from very fixed positions around the city to move people around. And as I said, this is part of a whole kind of like movement of geospatial startups looking to solve problems. This is a startup based in Munich called Lilium. They've just received 90 million from the Horizon Vision Fund. They're trying to solve the problem of mobility in built environments, but it doesn't necessarily obviously have to be a built environment. This is an electric taxi. It travels at 300 kilometers an hour. And if 80% of the world's population are going to be living in cities by the end of this century, according to most estimates, we're going to have to really think about some of the challenges we face around mobility, using data, using new technologies. And this is going to have an impact clearly on environments outside cities. If you can commute to a city quickly and easily, you have other options in terms of where you live. And it also opens up the possibilities in terms of environments that are remote being more easily reachable and can change our model of constantly expanding cities. Autonomous vehicles clearly are going to be part of our lives for in the next 5 or 10 years. They've logged hundreds of thousands of miles all over the world. Every automotive manufacturer is working on some version of this. What does it mean for them? It means they're technology players, right? They are having to sort of figure out who they're going to partner with, and they're going to think of themselves and their product as a platform as much as anything else. If you are a Tesla owner, you've been able to download software that upgrades your vehicle for the past 2 years. And Tesla argues that its vehicles are actually increase in value because the software additions make the car more valuable. In terms of consumer behavior, what this means is there's going to be a move away from ownership to an access model. So we pay for access to a network of vehicles, autonomous vehicles, vehicles we can drive, rather than actually purchasing a vehicle in the way that we would buy a Netflix subscription or an iTunes subscription. And I think that we need to think about how we're all going to be kind of constantly connected in this kind of broader ecosystem brought about by the Internet of Things, which I imagine is something that anyone working in the mining industry is thinking about. So at the moment, vehicle automation within heavy industry appears to be kind of limited to the use of GPS and a fusion of sensors like LiDAR, like radar. And full automation is only currently in place for kind of very heavy vehicles that are kind of make very repetitive maneuvers, like hauling ore or whatever. However, there is a real opportunity for heavy industry to be early adopters in this. Why? Heavy industry is used to automation, right? So car drivers might not like the idea of autonomous vehicles. Heavy industry is used to this automated world. We can see this happening. Think about the robots, that more dexterous kind of robot. Machinery will be more dexterous. It'll also have more autonomy. Economic efficiencies are clearly important. It can cost a lot of money to train someone to have the skills to operate heavy machinery. There's a clear economic advantage if we have autonomous vehicles. Thirdly, the main real problem, the obstacle we have to autonomous vehicles on our roads at the moment is safety, right? We're worried about other vehicles or pedestrians. These are very complex interactions. For the most part, mining machinery operates on private property, right? So, or on construction sites or whatever. That doesn't require the same amount of kind of dangerous and unpredictable interactions. So as I said, the advent of autonomous vehicles will see an enormous decrease of deaths on the road, and heavy industry, like mining, is clearly inherently dangerous, and autonomous systems will help to save lives. So clearly there are multiple incentives. Virtual reality. Until a couple of years ago, this technology had real major problems in terms of the latency. So people would put the goggles on, they'd be immersed in the world, and they would get nauseous. Now we have consumer products, hardware products out there in the marketplace that the consumers are beginning to experiment with. And I think that kind of like there are clear uses for it in mining in terms of training for people to understand environments and be taught how to respond to very particular scenarios before they experience them. And I think the real crucial thing about VR, as opposed to any other technology that we've ever developed, is that when you experience VR, or I should say, most technologies you think of, you're dealing with a screen, right? You're looking at a screen. You think of it as seeing something. When you put on a pair of goggles and enter a virtual reality environment, it's far more visceral, right? You have emotion afterwards. It feels like you've actually experienced something. So it's a very different kind of technological experience. And clearly there are use cases in medicine, education, retail, marketing, as well as entertainment. This is augmented reality, or mixed reality, as Microsoft likes to call it, or others call it. Clearly, there's a massive use case in mining. Obviously, VR, you put the goggles on, you're immersed in that world. Augmented reality, you see the real world, but you have a digital layer on top with which you can interact. Apple's doubling down on this. I'm sure if any of you have played Pokemon Go, you've already played with augmented reality. This is the Microsoft version. This is HoloLens, which is kind of sitting, I think it's getting good reviews. It's sitting nicely within Microsoft's productivity suite of tools and software and hardware. So I think we need to start considering how we use augmented and virtual reality so teams can communicate remotely, or we can see places or sites that we otherwise wouldn't be able to visualize. And there are multiple use cases for it as an enterprise tool, and clearly many applications where you can layer data on top of what the individual's seeing in mining, so that he or the person who's wearing the headset can interact with this data. And this is going to be particularly relevant as we enter the era of the Internet of Things. And one way I think it's being used at the moment is that we can kind of see complex machinery using augmented head display mounts. So that machinery can be monitored and data fed back to maintenance systems where it's compared with kind of background data to produce a real-time visualization of how a system is operating. So if we can attach sensors to everything, which we can these days, then they can provide us with real crucial data that can help with our decision-making, whether that's in the field or on site, because of this kind of technology. So clearly there's this multiple use cases with this kind of tech. From the virtual to the physical. So another way that bits and atoms is colliding is through 3D printing or additive manufacturing. So I think, actually, I'm going to skip ahead to this one. Does anyone know what this is? It's a sensor from a Boeing 777. It's part of an engine from a Rolls-Royce engine. It was the first part approved by the Federal Aviation Authority, the first 3D printed part from the Federal Aviation Authority to actually be licensed. So we're moving away from this era of 3D printing being sort of like for hobbyists and for kind of amateurs to an era in which 3D printing can be used for the direct manufacture of specialist components in industry, such as defense and automotive. And we're beginning to see the use of 3D printing in real large-scale projects. So for a few years now, we've seen sort of some of the work coming out of the Mediated Matter group at the MIT Media Lab, who've been working on the idea of robots that could 3D print buildings. Of course, they're already doing this in China, right? This developer has found a way of mixing building waste with concrete and extruding it in order to construct buildings. Last year, he printed 10 buildings in 24 hours for his company, which is on the edge of Shanghai. So so-called 3D printing is now being used by organizations at scale, and this technology is rapidly evolving. This is the work I was just mentioning from Skylar Tibbets at the MIT Media Lab. He calls this 4D printing, and the fourth dimension is time. So this is a real emerging technology, and it allows us to manufacture objects that then reshape themselves, or they reassemble over time. So this is a printed cube, and it's going to fold before your eyes. Or maybe you could think about a pipe, right, that's able to sense the need to expand or contract depending on the conditions. So essentially what Skylar Tibbets is trying to do is he's trying to build objects from programmable material. And the big idea is to create objects that can change after they're manufactured, making them self-adapting. And what this means is that the act of manufacturing is no longer the end of the creative process, but it's just a waypoint. So the networks we've built have given rise to this kind of vast distribution of knowledge, which has disrupted many industries. There's a lot of automation that's going to cause low-skilled workers to lose jobs, which I'm afraid it probably will. But if you think back in history to the 19th century, enormous disquiet in the north of England when mechanical looms were introduced. They did put a lot of people out of work. So we are going to lose all kinds of jobs, truck drivers, and particularly jobs in retail, I think. But then 10 or 15 years ago, there are all kinds of jobs that exist today. Jobs of app developers, engagement managers, CSR, that just didn't exist. We didn't have them. So in the future, there are going to be new types of roles. Automation will kill some, but they'll also introduce others. So in the future, we'll have like the job of personal data broker or chief trust officer, genomic portfolio director, AI business development manager, augmented reality journey planner. There are going to be changes, but if we focus on how we upskill, and that doesn't just mean low-skilled workers, that means everyone in this room, there are real opportunities there. But I think the next big disruption probably will happen in the white-collar sector. It will happen in insurance, accounting, legal services, a lot of back office tasks like human resources. And those changes are going to be driven by the protocol upon which the crypto coin Bitcoin is built, the blockchain. So forget Bitcoin for the moment. I noticed the valuation's gone through the roof again today. Let's talk about the blockchain. I'm sure most of you know what it is, but if you don't, it's a broadly distributed network of computers that acts as a ledger or a record. It can only be changed when there's consensus across the network, and it has a very high level of cryptography, so it's very hard to gain. Why is it important? Well, it changes the need for expensive, centralized third parties like banks and payment processors to authenticate and verify online exchanges of value. The other thing that's important about it, it makes money programmable. And what this means is the world's smartest and most creative software developers have an open platform to build products and services that allow individuals and enterprises to do business more efficiently, more productively than ever before. And if we digitize our assets, then these electronic assets can be entered into the digital ledger, and then proof of ownership becomes a matter of highly distributed public record. And this creates the whole notion of the idea of smart contracts, which could change the nature of all kinds of transactions. So if you digitize the property deeds to your house, you can then verify the transaction without needs of a third party to someone else. Car loan companies. Cars are effectively operating systems on wheels now. If you could digitize that, and you're an insurance company, if someone doesn't pay their insurance, you could then stop the car from moving anywhere if a payment isn't received via the blockchain. So there are multiple use cases, and clearly there are all kinds of ways that we can think about provenance, the way that we can track the provenance of particular objects. I know the diamond mining industry are thinking about how to use blockchain with a startup called Provenance, which is based here in London. The government, UK government's chief scientific officer, Sir Mark Walport, has already produced a report talking about how government can deliver services. So we're clearly in an era where this is something that's being considered. So I'm kind of almost out of time, but I just quickly want to sort of like look at AI as a final kind of thing to talk about. We are still a long way from kind of getting to the place where we really need to be in terms of AI having general purpose intelligence. But I think there are 4 kind of key areas to think about at the moment. So pattern recognition in data, software agents, basically various algorithms we can use, potential superhuman intelligence, which is what people talk about when they kind of talk about general purpose AI. But most importantly, I think, if you look back at some of the technologies that we've looked at in the presentation, it's an accelerant of other technologies. And I think there's 2 key areas where it can be applied to mining. First of all is pattern recognition at scale, so processing structured data, like information from sensors in mines or rigs or on rigs. And it could be used for rock identification or satellite imagery or geophysical maps or soil classification, all the stuff I was talking about when we were looking at drones. And clearly this can help with kind of accelerated decision making. Process automation at scale, again, something that AI is really good at this moment, and it'll only get better. And this is about basically just streamlining individual processes. That could be around safety, it could be around data analysis, it could be around operations. I'm out of time now, so I will just skip through this slide. It's basically talking about how quickly pattern recognition technology has developed just over the last 7 years, and how 7 years ago machines were 30% accurate with image recognition. Today it's about 100. It was better than a human being. The big players are all going to move into this area. Why? It's the new big opportunity for all big software companies. Think about how they offer cloud computing at scale. They will all be offering AI at scale very soon. Huge opportunity there. General purpose intelligence, we're still a long way away. Do follow this company, Google DeepMind. DeepMind was a startup based here in London, about half a mile that way, and they are doing incredible work. I'm just going to skip to the end of my presentation. I thought I'd just leave you this quote, right? This is a guy called Massimo Banzi, who is one of the principals behind the Arduino, which is a very small microcomputer. It's a bit like a Raspberry Pi. And I love this quote: you don't need anyone's permission to do something great. And the final thing I'd like to talk about is Ben Horowitz, the Silicon Valley venture capitalist and entrepreneur. He talks about where we are with technology at the moment as the very, 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 very early days of the internal combustion engine in the 19th century. And that invention didn't just give rise to the train and the automobile, it gave rise to some very, very major structural shifts, fundamental shifts in our economy. So the move from the countryside to the city, the move from an agricultural economy to an industrial one, the growth in cities, the growth in suburbs. And I think we need to be thinking about these big world-changing shifts that are going on around us now and will define our future, because the purpose of every single piece of technology that we've ever created isn't about the technology itself. The technology is created for one simple reason, which is human need. So I think we're going to continue doing a lot of what we've been doing for many years. We're going to be entertaining, educating, selling, exciting, improving, and making things more efficient through connecting our business processes and human beings in meaningful ways. That's one thing that's not going to change, because fundamentally it's not about technology, it really is just about us as human beings. Thanks a lot.